What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
My parents used to introduce my brothers, Jake and Aaron, as the pride of the family in a voice that carried the kind of certainty people reserve for church vows and mortgage payments. And when the smiling neighbor or the aunt from out of town glanced at me to complete the picture, my mother would pat my arm and say something vague like she is doing fine while already turning back to the boys. Because the story they liked telling never included me as anything more than background, and I learned early that if I wanted to be noticed, I had to make myself useful, which is how I ended up running errands nobody thanked me for, smoothing fights I did not start, and clapping for speeches that never once mentioned my name. It started when we were kids and never ended, because Jake played ball and Aaron did debate, and there were banners and bake sales and trips to away games, while my wins were things that did not photograph as well, like keeping grades steady, walking the neighbor's dog for extra cash, and figuring out how to file the financial aid form without anyone sitting beside me. And when I got a scholarship, my dad nodded like I had finally done something reasonable, then immediately asked if I could help Jake with his application essay, and I said yes, because saying no felt like picking a fight in a house where the rules were not written down, but they were enforced all the same. There is a particular kind of favoritism that does not sound like cruelty when you repeat it out loud, because it is delivered with smiles and family jokes and the kind of teasing people call harmless, so if you push back you look dramatic. And I swallowed a lot of it and told myself I was strong and independent and above it, while spending weekends driving Aaron to practice tests, rewriting Jake's resume line by line, and remembering every birthday, every appointment, every tiny thing that made the whole circus run, and in return I got to be the reliable one, the daughter they bragged about only as an accessory to the sons, as if my usefulness was the only reason I was at the table. By the time we were adults, the language had calcified, and my mother would still open calls with how proud she was of Jake's team lead promotion and how excited she was about Aaron's grad school trek. And then she would pivot to me with a question that sounded supportive, but always carried a sting, like, are you still doing that thing with the nonprofit or whatever it is? Which was funny because the nonprofit was my full-time job, and I had grown it from a desk in my apartment to a small staff, serving real people. But because it did not fit their idea of a trophy, they treated it like a hobby I would eventually outgrow, and every holiday I would show up early, set the table, field texts from both brothers, and hold my tongue while watching the two of them receive the kind of attention that makes a person stand taller without even realizing it. The breaking point looked ordinary, which is how most breaking points arrive, because it was a family dinner for my dad's work anniversary at a mid-range place he liked, and my mother asked me to organize the reservation, pick up the cake, and discreetly settle the tip with the manager because she did not want to fuss at the table, and I said sure and did it all, then watched as the speeches started and my dad toasted his sons for making him proud, and my mother talked about how raising boys had been the joy of her life, and when I mentioned that my team had just secured a year-long grant that would keep our program running and expand it into another county, my mother smiled the way you smile at a child who shows you a drawing and said, "That is nice, honey. But let us not make this about work," and then she turned to Aaron to ask how he liked his new office, and I felt something cold and clean slide into place in my chest, not rage and not sadness, but a certainty that my position in this family was fixed, and it was never going to change no matter how hard I worked or how kind I stayed. After dinner, I paid the tip as requested and carried the extra cake slices out to the car and sat there longer than I needed to, thinking about how many favors I had banked that never counted, how many times I had driven across town to solve a problem I did not create, and how easy it would be for them to keep living exactly the same way if I kept volunteering to be the glue, and I realized that my usefulness was the leash. Because as long as I kept the calendar and the secrets and the peace, they never had to face what they had done, which was to raise a daughter who could build a life with both hands, and then tell her to stand to the side while they posed with the sons. When I tell you I cut ties, I do not mean that I slammed doors or gave speeches or typed paragraphs in a family chat, because that would have given them a scene to fight with and a story where I looked unreasonable, and I had no interest in playing that part. So what I did instead was decide that I am done being the quiet engine that keeps their days from stalling, and I chose silence, not as a tantrum, but as a boundary, and I made a plan that would not announce itself with fireworks yet would be impossible to ignore once it took effect. That night I scrolled through old threads and skimmed the same jokes about how I am the responsible one and the boys are the stars, and I saw my replies full of helpful reminders and checklists and little heart reactions I now hated. And I understood that I had trained them to expect me, which meant I could retrain them by leaving, and the thought did not feel cruel so much as accurate, like I was finally grading a test I had been forced to take for years, and the answer key said stop. So I went home and wrote down everything I did for this family that nobody saw: the birthdays queued, the doctor appointments tracked, the errands run, the last-minute rides, the flights booked, the deposits spotted. And I looked at the list until it stopped looking like love and started looking like labor they never acknowledged. And then I folded the paper and put it in a drawer I never open, because I did not need a souvenir, I needed momentum. The first act of revenge, if you can call it that, was simple and almost boring, because there was no speech and no dramatic exit, just a decision that the favors are over, the calendar is theirs, the mess belongs to the people who made it. And the next morning I began with the smallest click that changed everything, and by the end of that week my number did not ring in their house, and my inbox did not carry their plans, and the silence around me did not feel empty, it felt earned, and if you think they took it well, you are not ready for what happened next. The morning after that dinner, when the clapping had faded and the polite smiles were somewhere on a bill I had already paid, I sat at my kitchen table and did the unglamorous work of disappearing, which started with blocking every saved number that belonged to my parents and my brothers, muting the group thread with its endless chain of reminders and half-jokes, removing myself from the shared calendar where I had been the one entering birthdays and dentist appointments and flight times, canceling the autopays that I had set up because no one else remembered due dates, and untangling my card from the family phone plan so that, for the first time in years, their lives no longer drew a steady drip from my account while my name went unmentioned at every toast, and I did it quietly and methodically, not out of spite, but because boundaries are only boundaries when they have teeth and paperwork. The first day was a chorus of missed calls from familiar names, then a wave of unknown numbers that I recognized as my mother's talent for recruiting other people to deliver her messages, and I watched them stack up without listening. Not because I did not care, but because I knew exactly what the early messages would sound like, that bright tone of fake confusion that says we do not understand what is wrong. Can you call us back? Followed very quickly by the offended pushback that says you are being dramatic. Stop making everything about you. And then, when that failed to move me, the final swing into the kind of guilt that has always been their favorite instrument, the one that begins with "we did everything for you" and ends with "you are breaking this family." And the only reason I knew all of this so precisely was because I had lived it in smaller cycles for years, picking up after a day or a week and offering a soft landing so that they could return to normal without ever having to ask what normal cost me. I did not go to work and cry in a bathroom, and I did not pace my apartment staring at the wall, because the truth is my life had more structure than their version of me allowed, and the nonprofit I ran did not pause for family theatrics. So I answered staff messages, reviewed a grant report, ate lunch at my desk, and told our front desk that I was not accepting any unscheduled visitors for the next few weeks, a policy we should have had anyway. And when a cousin I liked texted to say that my mother had asked her to check on me, I wrote back as kindly as I could manage that I was fine, that I was taking space, and that I did not want any messages forwarded. Then I put my phone in a drawer and worked until the workday ended. Because I have learned that nothing settles the nervous system like being useful to people who actually respect the help. The thing about being the household fixer is that you do not realize how many small levers you are pulling until you let go and the machine lurches. So within a week I heard from an aunt that Thanksgiving planning had gone off the rails because I was the one who kept the list of who brings what and which casserole dish belongs to which neighbor. And the family cloud album that I had built and maintained for years no longer opened for them because it was tied to my account that I had now made. private, and the streaming passwords were no longer valid because they had always been mine, and the shared to-do lists that kept track of our father's medications and our mother's bill reminders looked blank because I had been the one writing every entry. And while none of this was catastrophic, it was the slow removal of scaffolding that had kept the shaky structure standing, and I felt an almost physical relief as I watched the dust settle without raising my hand to be helpful. Jake texted from a new number with the tone of a man who has been told to fix something he does not understand, accusing me of being petty because the family plan had reverted and his bill went up. And he told me I was acting like a child because no one cares about my little subscription tantrum, which would have stung a year ago but now read like a bad script, while Aaron tried a different tactic, asking if we could just talk like adults because mom is worried sick and dad is not sleeping, and the pivot from mockery to concern landed exactly the way it always has, which is to say it slid right off. Because the point of my silence was not to punish them randomly, but to show them what happens when the person they keep insisting is extra suddenly stops being the backbone. And if a higher phone bill was what it took for them to notice the invisible labor they had mistaken for air, then I was not going to get in the way of that lesson. What surprised me was how quickly the larger holes started to show, because within 2 weeks my mother left a voicemail through a distant relative saying the property tax reminder never arrived and the late fee felt unfair given everything going on. And I let the message sit there on my screen, a neat little monument to the behind-the-scenes system I had built, the calendar nudges and labeled envelopes and day of alarms that had kept their household from being fined, and I did not swoop in with the dates or the link or the friendly script for the customer service call, because while I had always believed that being the competent one would buy me a little respect, what it had actually bought me was an unpaid position, and I was, finally, resigning. There were moments that tested me, like the day an unknown number turned out to be my father calling from his office line to tell me that this was beneath me and that grown women do not run away. And he said it in a voice that tried to sound reasonable but carried the same old command, the same assumption that I would apologize so the family could stop feeling uncomfortable, and the only answer that felt true was not an argument but a quiet refusal. So I listened for a bit, I let him finish the speech, and then I hung up, blocked the new number, and took a long walk around the block with my phone still in the drawer at home, because peace is not always polite, and sometimes it is nothing more than choosing not to step back into a room where the floor keeps collapsing. If you are wondering how this qualifies as revenge when it looks like absence, then you probably never had to be the uncredited project manager of a family, because the cleanest way to explode a bad system is to stop feeding it. And that week I did one more thing that was small on paper but seismic in effect, which was to close the shared gift fund account that sat under my name, the account I had quietly topped off all year and used to cover deposits and emergencies, and, yes, surprise presents. That allowed my parents to pretend generosity cost them nothing, and I transferred every remaining dollar I had personally put there into a separate savings labeled with my own name and my own goals. Then I emailed the bank to remove all linked users and archive the login details, and I did it without a grand announcement or a nasty note, because the point was not to humiliate anyone, it was to make the ledger honest. And when the next holiday rolled around and there was no cushion for their overspending and no invisible safety net to make their planning look effortless, the phone lit up with messages that did not sound like orders or lectures anymore, but something else entirely. Something that started to resemble acknowledgement if not yet apology. And if you think I broke at that sound, you do not know me, because I was just getting started and they had not even begun to understand the quiet power of being cut out of my life by me. Silence has a way of stripping the shine off family myths, because once the noise of my constant yes fell away, the room got very quiet, and in that quiet my parents had to face the truth that the daughter they kept calling independent, as if that word were an excuse to ignore her, had actually been the one holding the scaffolding while the celebrated sons posed for pictures, and the first proof arrived not as drama but as paperwork, little failures that stacked in a boring yet undeniable pile. Like overdue notices that used to be caught by my calendar pings, missed confirmations for medical appointments I had always scheduled, and a clumsy argument about who was bringing what to Thanksgiving because the spreadsheet everyone pretended was a family tradition had lived on my laptop and apparently no one had ever downloaded a copy. which made me laugh in a way that did not feel cruel so much as clean, because you cannot apologize for gravity when you drop a plate and it shatters, you can only acknowledge you were not holding it. The stories filtered to me through cousins and neighbors and, hilariously, a former Booster Club mom who had my number from a fundraiser years ago, each one delivered in that careful tone people use when they want to pass news without taking sides. And while I did not ask for details, I did not stop them either, because information is not the same as involvement. So I learned that my mother tried to host a birthday that collapsed under the weight of her own expectations when the cake order was never picked up and the guest list turned into a mess of duplicate invites and missing addresses. And I learned that my father, who always pretended financial logistics were beneath his attention because he was busy with important things, spent an afternoon at the bank trying to untangle the automatic transfers I had set up years ago to keep late fees from snowballing, and he came home muttering about how customer service has gone downhill without stopping to consider that maybe what had gone downhill was the reliable person who used to make the calls before the problems ever reached him. Jake, who has always been a big-picture guy in the way that men call themselves strategic when they do not care about details, began lashing out at Aaron for not stepping up. And Aaron fired back that he had his own life and that the problem here was actually mom and dad refusing to treat me like an adult with a real job. And the irony of watching my brothers finally say to each other the things I had said quietly for years without anyone listening landed like a private joke, because while they were arguing about who should fix what, the actual fix was not coming, and that was the point. Since I had made a choice to remove myself from the role of family janitor, and I was not going to rush back in with a broom just because two men who have never cleaned a mess were suddenly offended by the sight of one. There were moments that tested my resolve, like the voicemail where my mother cried in that brittle way that is half tears and half performance, and said she does not know who she is anymore if her daughter will not answer, and for a second I felt that old reflex warm up. The one that says get in the car and bring flowers and smooth it over, but I let the reflex pass through me without acting, because the difference between kindness and self-erasure is whether you are allowed to have limits, and I was finally enforcing mine not with a lecture or a scene, but with sustained absence that created space for reality to show itself, and in that space the things no one wanted to say became unavoidable. Like the fact that my parents had built a family brand on the backs of the boys, and then outsourced the unglamorous labor to me under the banner of love. Because I do not believe in chaos as a lifestyle, I chose a measured step that felt less like an explosion and more like an audit, and I wrote a single email to the accountant, the insurance broker, and the family attorney who had always routed questions through me. A short and professional note stating that I was no longer handling administrative matters for my parents or my brothers, that I was withdrawing any informal authorizations previously granted, and that all future communications should go directly to the relevant parties, and I copied everyone with a calm tone that left no edges for anyone to grab. And the reply from the accountant was a polite thank you with a request for updated contact information that none of them seemed ready to provide, which was not my problem anymore. And the broker responded with a list of renewal dates that landed squarely in my mother's inbox where they belonged, and as small as that email looked, it was the administrative equivalent of removing my name from a deed I never signed, because from that moment forward no one could pretend that I was obligated to keep their plates spinning. The next step, which I will admit gave me a petty thrill that I am not interested in apologizing for, involved the storage unit I had been paying for since college, the one stacked with boxes my parents refused to sort but also refused to let go. Because nothing says control like holding your child's past in a rented room and reminding her that a real daughter would stop by to check on it, and I closed the account with a clean transfer of responsibility, set a firm deadline, and sent one neutral message with the new lease details and a reminder that the unit would be cleared if no payment posted by a certain date, and then I backed away, because whether the baby books and team jerseys and dusty knickknacks lived or died was not my story to manage anymore. And when my mother called a cousin in a panic because it turned out she liked the idea of having my childhood in a box more than the reality of paying the bill, I heard about it over the weekend and felt nothing but a lightness that startled me, because nothing about that unit had ever been about love. It had been about leverage, and I had finally cut the line. If you want to know when I realized they were truly slipping, it was the afternoon my father left a message that did not try to scold or reframe or swagger through the problem, a small, tired voice asking me which passwords controlled the shared photo archive because he wanted to make a slideshow for a work thing and could not find the files. And I sat at my desk and stared at the transcript of that call and thought about all the years he had walked past me to brag about the boys, then looked at the phone and felt the tug of the old script where I saved the day and buy myself a temporary seat at their table, and I chose not to pick up, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect, because the price of admission had always been my invisibility, and I no longer accept those terms. By the time the holidays loomed and the calendar felt like a slow-motion test designed by a petty god, my brothers had stopped sniping at me and started sniping at each other. My parents had cycled through denial and anger and landed in that gray valley called bargaining, and the family group thread, which I still did not read, was apparently a rolling crisis about who would host and who would pay and who would assemble the folding tables that used to appear like magic because I had reserved them months in advance, and as I listened to these updates drift in from the edges, I realized that the story had tilted in my favor without me pushing, because when a machine loses the part that actually does the work, people can spend a long time debating which of the shiny parts is most important while nothing runs, and standing in that awareness, I felt something I had never felt with them before, a grounded sense that I was not cornered, that I was not obligated, that I had choices and leverage of my own, and that I could pick the moment and the method of the next move with care instead of impulse. So I did one more quiet thing that would look unremarkable to anyone outside our family, but would destabilize the core story my parents loved to repeat, and I reached out to the one person they still revered without question. A longtime family friend who had known me since I was little and who now ran a civic foundation with an annual gala my parents never missed because they enjoyed being photographed near other people's generosity. And I said yes to something I had been invited to for years, and always declined out of deference to family plans, and I arranged, without fanfare and without mentioning it to anyone at home, for my work to be recognized that night with a grant announcement that had nothing to do with my parents and everything to do with the results I had built while they were busy praising the boys, and after the paperwork was signed and the date set, I sat back and watched my family scramble over potlucks and seating charts and guilt trips, knowing that an event they considered theirs had just become the stage for a lesson they were not ready for, and if you think I warned them or softened the landing, then you still underestimate me the way they did, because some truths do not arrive by invitation, they arrive by spotlight. I wish I could tell you that the family finally calmed down and grew reflective once the practical chaos made it obvious that my role had never been ornamental. But the truth is that people who have grown comfortable outsourcing responsibility rarely surrender it without a fight, so the calls kept coming through cousins and church friends, and even a neighbor who once asked me for donation receipts for items she never donated. Each message cycling through the same old stations of confusion and blame and half apology, while I kept doing the one thing that continued to feel both unfamiliar and completely right, which was nothing, because silence, when it is a boundary rather than a weapon, has a way of forcing other people to hear themselves. And that is exactly what began to happen as the practical consequences kept landing, not catastrophic disasters that could be spun into tragedies, but the kind of steady, embarrassing friction that erodes a story from the inside, like a mist. Renewal here, a duplicate payment there, and a holiday plan that dissolved into finger-pointing because the person who used to keep track of the serving spoons had stopped pretending that this was her calling in life. In that same spirit of calm, unglamorous clarity, I handled 3 pieces of unfinished business that had always sat under my name and never under my authority, and I handled them with paperwork rather than speeches, beginning with a notarized letter to every medical office that had me listed as the first call in case of emergency, a designation awarded to me years ago under the flattering label of reliability and never revisited despite the presence of 2 fully grown sons, and I replaced myself with the actual legal next of kin and attached the brothers' numbers with a brief sentence stating that I was not available for non-consensual caregiving. Then I boxed up the spare house keys I had carried since high school and shipped them by certified mail with delivery confirmation that did not require anyone to thank me. And finally, I closed the last shared account I had been funding under the illusion that family meant a permanent line of credit, sending one short, polite email with the balance breakdown and the transfer receipts so that no one could pretend I had taken anything that was not already mine. And when the replies came, a shocked question from my mother about timing, an exasperated dig from Jake about drama, a thin plea from Aaron about discussing this like adults, I did what I had promised myself I would do, which was to let the messages sit unanswered until the heat bled out of them, and the facts of the new arrangement became the facts, because you cannot negotiate with gravity. All of that would have been enough to mark a turning point, yet the real pivot came when the date for the Civic Foundation Gala drew close, a night my parents treated like a holiday because nothing thrilled them quite like being photographed near other people's generosity. And because I had quietly accepted the foundation's plan to recognize my work with a grant announcement, I found myself in the rare position of being able to set terms without shouting, so I did what competent people do when they're finally allowed to be deliberate, and I met with the event coordinator to sponsor a table under my nonprofit's name, then asked that the seats be given to the people who almost never get invited to those rooms, but carry the work on their backs, which meant staff from our clinic, a teacher who had kept our pilot program afloat when the district was disorganized, 2 clients who were comfortable being public about their journeys, and the retired social worker who had mentored me when I knew almost nothing and still made things happen, and I asked one more thing that felt both small and surgical, which was that my parents' customary table, the one they claimed every year through the foundation friend who adores them, be placed on the opposite side of the room, and that all communications about their seating go through the foundation rather than through me, because I wanted them to experience the event the way everyone else did, without a private concierge disguised as a daughter smoothing the path at every turn. The confirmation emails went out 2 weeks before the gala, and even though I did not see them directly, I did not need to, because within hours the family grapevine lit up with confused questions about seat assignments and whether my name on the sponsor list was a typo, followed by a sputtering suggestion from my father that this looked like a stunt and a miserable attempt from my mother to rebrand the whole thing as a nice surprise we planned together, and while a different version of me might have jumped in to rescue their pride before they embarrassed themselves, the current version of me simply forwarded the foundation's public link showing the honorees and the sponsors, and then closed the browser, because I wanted the documentation to do the talking that I no longer intended to do. Meanwhile, the brothers continued their duet of denial and deflection, with Jake insisting that I should at least loop them in on talking points so Mom does not look blindsided, and Aaron attempting to play mediator by suggesting a quick family meeting at a coffee shop to iron things out, both of which would have been clever if this were about optics rather than history, and I wrote back to neither of them, choosing instead to finalize a detail that mattered to me more than any photograph, which was the wording of the grant announcement itself, a single paragraph that credited the results to an unglamorous coalition of people who do the work no one sees, and titled the gift with a phrase that had followed me my whole life and finally belonged to me. The pride is in the work, a line that would land like a bell in a room full of people who knew exactly how families, companies, and entire towns get built, not with pageantry, but with the person who keeps showing up when nobody is clapping. On the afternoon of the gala, I did not rehearse a speech in the mirror or assemble a costume meant to communicate anything to anyone. I simply printed the program draft, checked the donor ledger one last time, and turned off every alert on my phone except one, a silent vibration reserved for the foundation contact in case a client guest needed support. And when I walked into the venue through a side entrance with my team, I saw the room the way the room sees itself before the crowd arrives, which is to say as a floor plan with names on paper, and there, on opposite ends of the diagram, sat the 2 tables that would finally tell a story I had been waiting my entire life to hear, one with my parents and their friends, the other with my people and our work, and as the doors opened and the noise rose and the lights began their slow climb, I watched my parents enter in that familiar way that announces certainty, then hover at the check-in table a beat too long, then look down at their name, cards, then look up toward the front where the sponsor plaques were already lit. And even from across the room I could feel the moment hit because their faces did that tiny shift people do when the script they wrote in their heads collides with the actual program in their hands. I took my seat without waving, slid my phone face down beside the program where my name appeared next to the grant title they had never imagined could be mine. And when the foundation director stepped to the microphone and the room settled into that hush people pay money to experience, a message from an unknown number rolled across my screen with a last-minute plea to meet in the lobby because we should present as a family. And I let it pass unacknowledged as the first chords of the intro music swelled, because the last time I had presented as part of this family my name had been a footnote, and tonight the footnote had become the headline, and if you think I stood up to make a speech for them, you have not been listening. Because what came next did not need my voice to land exactly where it was meant to. When the foundation director stepped up and the room settled into that hush people buy with tickets and babysitters and dry cleaning, I felt the kind of steady calm that does not come from triumph but from alignment. Because for once the story about me was going to be told in a room where results spoke louder than relatives, and when she began to describe a program that took shape in the cracks between other people's priorities, a program that kept families afloat with casework no one photographs, and she said my name not as an afterthought, but as the person who built the thing and kept it alive through sheer persistence and boring spreadsheets and unglamorous meetings. I did not look across the room to see my parents' faces, because I already knew what they would show the moment the screen lit with the header they had never given me. The pride is in the work. And the applause that followed did not feel like revenge so much as confirmation that I had not been delusional all those years. When I walked into rooms and made things happen with no camera pointed in my direction. The program rolled the announcement with the kind of concise clarity I had asked for. A grant earmarked for expanding legal aid clinics inside our partner sites and a scholarship fund for first-generation social workers who had decided that change was not a slogan but a job. And then the director added a line I had fought to keep in even when the copy editor called it too pointed, a recognition of the invisible people who pay the invisible costs while others collect the visible credit, and you could feel the room lean toward that sentence because everyone over a certain age understands exactly what it means to carry a place on your back while being told you are lucky to be invited. And only then did I allow myself to glance across the sea of round tables toward the familiar silhouettes, where my mother's smile had frozen just a little too wide and my father's jaw had settled into that careful chew he does when he wants the moment to pass without having to admit he misread it, and I let the sight register without letting it decide how I felt, because that was the whole point of this night, to decouple my sense of reality from their reaction. I did not stand up to give a speech because I had asked not to, preferring a short onstage thank you with my team clustered beside me, and when the moment came I kept it clean and practical, crediting our staff by name and thanking the clients who had agreed to be present even though public rooms are not always kind, and then I closed with a sentence that had been sitting in my ribs for years waiting to be said out loud, that the measure of a life is not the volume of applause at family dinners, but the number of people who sleep a little easier because you did your job, and it landed not like a punch, but like the click of a latch closing on something that had rattled loose for too long, and I stepped down before emotion could make me sentimental, because I wanted the record to show that this was about work, not theater. What happened next could have turned messy in a different story, because there was a reception with name tags and champagne and all the social choreography my parents love, yet the difference tonight was structural. Since my table became a small parade of handshakes from people who actually knew what we do and wanted to help, while across the room my parents had to field congratulations that did not orbit around them, which is a specific kind of discomfort for people who have always treated recognition like a family heirloom that passes only to the sons, and somewhere in that swirl my father tried a pivot I recognized from his professional life, the friendly takeover of a narrative he did not build, by walking toward our group with his old confident stride and saying he wanted to get a photo with the team for the family album, and before he reached us the foundation director slid in with that efficient grace every woman in charge learns, thanked him for attending, and gently redirected him toward his table because the honorees needed to finish press materials, a kindness that doubled as a boundary, and I watched him adjust his tie the way men do when they hit a wall they did not expect. By the time the lights came up and the room began that polite drift toward coats and leftover desserts, my phone carried more messages than I had seen in months. Not the scolding blasts of the early days, but a ragged stack of half-apologies and strategic amnesia. And I let them sit for the length of the drive home before opening a blank email and writing the only thing I was willing to say, that if they wanted a conversation it would happen with a therapist in the room, that we would use names for what had been happening instead of euphemisms, that the phrase pride of the family would be retired from our vocabulary the way you retire a jersey when the team changes direction, that we would stop rewriting history to protect anyone's ego, and that I was not coming back to unpaid labor disguised as love, and I sent it to my parents and blind copied my brothers with a calm subject line and no invitation to debate, because this was not a negotiation, it was the terms required for any future contact, and anything less would put me back in the role I had already resigned. In the days that followed, the fallout arrived in waves that looked different from the old storms, with my mother sending a message that danced around the word sorry without quite touching it, and my father forwarding an article about second chances without saying for whom, and Jake sending a text that was probably the closest he could get to humility, that he had not understood the volume of what I was doing and wanted to know where to start, while Aaron asked for the therapist's contact and then, more quietly, asked if he could donate to the scholarship without making it a family production, and I answered only the last two because those were actions rather than performances, and I let the others hang there in the quiet. Not as punishment, but as a pause where understanding could either grow or wither without me watering it. On a Sunday afternoon a week later, I unlocked the drawer with the folded list I had written on the first night of this whole thing. The ledger of invisible tasks and small rescues and emergency transfers that had kept a family running while I was treated like a spare part. And I read it line by line, not to reignite anger, but to confirm that what I had done was not cruel or dramatic or ungrateful. It was accurate, and I tore it in half and then in quarters and dropped it in the bin, because I did not need to keep score anymore. The point had been made and the system had been rebuilt with me on the outside by choice, and in that quiet I felt the precise satisfaction I had been chasing without knowing it. Not the sugary rush of payback, but the clean weight of a boundary that held. People like to ask whether I forgave them, as if forgiveness were the prize at the end of the obstacle course, and I tell them that the question is premature, because what they want to know is whether the story has a picture-perfect ending with hugs and matching sweaters. When the truth is more adult and, to me, more hopeful, which is that some things were said out loud for the first time in a therapist's office with a clock on the wall and a person taking notes, that my parents are learning how to speak without handing me chores in the same sentence, that my brothers have started showing up with more than words, and that I am not rushing to label any of it a miracle. I am just letting reality have time to breathe. And if it keeps breathing, then maybe we will build something new, and if it does not, then I will be exactly where I already am, intact and respected in the life I built without their permission. They used to call my brothers the pride of the family in rooms where the script never changed, and now the line lives where it always should have lived, in the work, which means they can keep their phrase if they like, because it no longer has the power to shrink me. And if you are looking for a final flourish or a dramatic door slam, you will not find it here, only the quiet click of a boundary locking and the open space that follows, where they will either learn the language of respect or learn the shape of my absence, and either outcome, to my surprise and to my relief, feels like a win I do not need anyone else to announce.